On the evening of July 29th, 2022, the machinery of violence inside California's prison system claimed another life. Behind the reinforced walls and razor wire of Pelican Bay State Prison, a place built to contain the most dangerous offenders in the state, a young man was slaughtered in full view of an institution that has long struggled to contain gang-driven bloodshed. His name was Uriel Otero, and at just 22 years old, his life ended not on the streets that first shaped his criminal path, but inside a housing unit day room, an area meant to represent controlled normalcy in one of the most restrictive prisons in America. At approximately 5:33 p.m., Otero was inside the shared day room when the attack erupted. There were no warning sirens, no dramatic buildup, just sudden, decisive violence. According to prison officials, another inmate, 23-year-old Fernando Torres Lopez, launched a fatal assault that would leave Otero gravely wounded. The precise mechanics of the attack were not publicly detailed, but the outcome was unmistakable. Otero had been slayed. Within minutes, the day room became a crime scene, and Pelican Bay once again lived up to its reputation as a place where control is fragile and death can arrive without notice. Correctional staff rushed in as Otero collapsed, suffering from injuries so severe that survival was unlikely from the moment the assault concluded. He was transported for emergency medical treatment within the facility, but the damage had already been done. At 6:20 p.m., less than an hour after the attack began, Uriel Otero was pronounced dead. His homicide was swift, brutal, and final, a reminder that even within maximum security walls, lethal violence remains a constant threat. Both Otero and Torres Lopez were products of the same violent ecosystem long before they ever crossed paths inside Pelican Bay. Each had been deeply involved in street gang activity, and each had already committed acts of extreme violence prior to incarceration. In 2021, just 1 year before his death, Otero had been sentenced to 25 years in state prison for attempted second-degree homicide and related charges. His youth stood in stark contrast to the severity of his crimes, illustrating how early gang affiliation can accelerate individuals toward irreversible outcomes. Torres Lopez's background followed a similar trajectory. Also sentenced in 2021, he received a term of 19 years and 8 months for attempted second-degree homicide, along with assault and firearm-related charges tied to gang violence. Both men entered the California prison system carrying long sentences, hardened reputations, and unresolved conflicts rooted in street alliances and rivalries. When individuals like this are placed in close proximity, violence often becomes inevitable, no matter how restrictive the environment. Pelican Bay State Prison has long been synonymous with extreme security measures, including prolonged isolation, reinforced housing units, and intensive surveillance. Yet despite these controls, gang influence continues to operate beneath the surface. Housing unit day rooms, while monitored, are one of the few spaces where inmates interact more freely, and they have repeatedly served as flashpoints for sudden assaults. Otero's homicide unfolded in one such space, highlighting the limitations of even the most aggressive containment strategies. The killing did not occur in isolation. Otero's death was one of 3 inmate homicides investigated by California prison authorities within a single week in July 2022. That grim statistic sent shockwaves through the correctional system, raising renewed concerns about institutional safety, gang management, and the effectiveness of segregation policies. Each homicide underscored the same brutal truth. Incarceration does not dissolve gang allegiance. It often concentrates it. In the aftermath of the attack, Fernando Torres Lopez was immediately removed from the general population and placed in solitary confinement. This form of isolation, often used following prison homicides, serves both as punishment and as a protective measure, shielding the suspect from retaliation while investigators begin their work. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation confirmed that the prison's Investigative Services Unit launched a full inquiry, working alongside the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office to determine whether additional criminal charges would be filed. Prison homicides present unique investigative challenges. Witnesses are often unwilling to cooperate, evidence is limited by controlled environments, and gang codes of silence remain deeply entrenched. Every movement, every interaction, and every prior conflict between the individuals involved must be reconstructed to understand how the slaying unfolded and whether it could have been prevented. Uriel Otero's death represents more than a single act of violence. It is a case study in how the cycle of gang-related bloodshed continues long after the courtroom sentences are handed down. His homicide serves as a stark reminder that prison is not the end of violence for many offenders. It is merely a different battlefield, one governed by hierarchy, reputation, and retribution. The same forces that drove Otero and Torres Lopez toward attempted homicide on the streets followed them through the prison gates, where they ultimately collided with fatal consequences. As night fell over Pelican Bay on July 29, 2022, another cell was sealed, another investigation opened, and another name was added to the growing list of inmates who would never leave the system alive. For correctional officials, the homicide was another crisis to manage. For the families involved, it was the irreversible finality of death. And for the institution itself, it was further evidence that even the most fortified prisons remain vulnerable to the violent legacies inmates bring with them. The slaughter of Uriel Otero stands as a grim testament to the enduring reach of gang violence, the limits of institutional control, and the human cost of a system perpetually struggling to contain men already conditioned to resolve conflict through bloodshed. Inside the reinforced concrete and steel of Pelican Bay State Prison, violence does not erupt by accident. It emerges slowly, shaped by history, gang loyalty, and long sentences that leave little room for escape. One such eruption ended in homicide when inmate Michael Shalon was slaughtered inside the institution, adding yet another body to the prison's long and bloody legacy. While official records stop short of naming the specific street gang affiliations involved, the circumstances surrounding Shalon's death reveal a familiar pattern, one defined by gang-enhanced sentences, extreme violence, and men who had already crossed the point of no return long before arriving at Pelican Bay. Michael Shalon was not new to violence. In 2009, he was sentenced in Ventura County for voluntary manslaughter, committed as a member of a street gang. That conviction carried a gang enhancement, a legal acknowledgement that the homicide was not an isolated act, but part of a larger criminal identity rooted in organized street violence. By the time he reached Pelican Bay, Shalon was already deeply embedded in the culture of prison survival, where reputation, alliances, and perceived weakness can determine whether a man lives or dies. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has confirmed Shalon's sentence and gang enhancement, but has deliberately avoided identifying the specific street gang connected to either him or the men suspected of slaying him. This omission is not unusual. In California's prison system, naming gang affiliations can inflame tensions, complicate prosecutions, and place targets on inmates and their families. Yet the absence of names does little to obscure the reality. This was not random violence. It was organized, collective, and deliberate. The incident unfolded within Pelican Bay, a prison designed to contain the state's most violent offenders. Despite its reputation for strict control, the facility remains vulnerable to sudden explosions of brutality, particularly when inmates with overlapping gang histories from Southern California are housed in close proximity. On the day of the homicide, multiple inmates were implicated in what authorities believe was a coordinated assault that ended with Shalon's Slade. Joseph A. Quintero was identified as a central figure in the initial physical altercation. Quintero was already serving a life sentence for first-degree homicide out of Los Angeles County. A conviction of that magnitude signals not just capacity for violence, but comfort with it. Men serving life sentences operate under different rules. With nothing left to lose, disciplinary consequences often mean little, and violent acts become tools of enforcement, retaliation, or status maintenance. Michael Jones, another suspected assailant, was discovered near the scene following the homicide. Jones was serving time for robbery, a crime that often acts as a gateway into more serious violence within prison hierarchies. Robbery convictions, while less severe than homicide, still place inmates within violent networks where loyalty and participation are expected. Presence near the scene in a prison homicide is rarely coincidental. In an environment governed by silence and surveillance, proximity alone can suggest involvement. Oscar Monsibay was also named among the suspected attackers. Monsibay was serving a 15-year sentence for attempted homicide and multiple firearms offenses. His criminal history reflected a willingness to use lethal force, even if prior attempts fell short of ending a life. In the prison ecosystem, attempted homicide carries nearly the same weight as completed homicide. It marks an inmate as capable and dangerous, someone who can be trusted when violence is required. Omar Arzadeh completed the list of suspects. Arzadeh was serving a nearly 30-year sentence for assault with a machine gun and kidnapping. Crimes involving military-grade firepower indicate extreme escalation and organizational backing. Assault with a machine gun is not impulsive, it is deliberate, tactical, and often tied to organized criminal activity. Kidnapping further underscores a willingness to exert total control over victims. By the time Arzadeh entered Pelican Bay, violence was already a defining feature of his identity. Together, these men represented a concentration of extreme criminality rarely found outside the prison system. Each had committed violent acts on the streets of Southern California. Each carried long sentences that ensured they would spend decades, if not the rest of their lives, behind bars. And each existed within a closed world where disputes are settled not through dialogue, but through bloodshed. What exactly triggered the assault on Michael R. Shalon remains officially undisclosed. Prison homicide investigations often withhold details to protect ongoing prosecutions and prevent retaliatory violence. But within the prison culture, such attacks typically stem from one of three causes: gang discipline, perceived betrayal, or unresolved street conflicts carried into custody. Regardless of the catalyst, the outcome was final. Shalon was overwhelmed, outnumbered, and ultimately slaughtered. The homicide was not the act of a single man acting in isolation. The presence of multiple suspected assailants suggests coordination, a collective decision to remove Shalon from the equation permanently. In prison gang dynamics, group participation serves multiple purposes. It spreads culpability, reinforces loyalty, and sends a message that violence is sanctioned and enforced by the group as a whole. Following the attack, correctional officers secured the area and initiated emergency response procedures. But as in many prison homicides, intervention came too late. Once an assault reaches its conclusion, survival becomes unlikely. Chalonet's death added another statistic to Pelican Bay's history, but behind that statistic was a man whose life had been shaped and ultimately ended by gang violence. The CDCR placed the suspected assailants under investigation, separating them from the general population, and launching a joint inquiry involving the prison's investigative services unit. Such investigations are meticulous and slow, relying on surveillance footage, informant testimony, and forensic evidence collected within an environment where every movement is monitored and every word is weighed. Yet prison homicide cases are among the most difficult to prosecute. Witnesses often refuse to cooperate out of fear of retaliation. Gang codes of silence are rigidly enforced. Even inmates facing life sentences may still avoid testifying, knowing that cooperation can make daily survival impossible. As a result, accountability is often delayed, fragmented, or entirely internal, handled through administrative sanctions rather than additional criminal convictions. Michael R. Shalon's death illustrates a grim reality of California's prison system. Gang-related violence does not end at sentencing. Instead, it migrates behind bars, where old rivalries harden and new ones form. The same affiliations that fueled voluntary manslaughter on the streets continue to dictate life and death decisions inside prison walls. Pelican Bay was designed to isolate violence, but isolation does not erase ideology, loyalty, or resentment. When inmates with overlapping gang histories converge in a single institution, the prison becomes a pressure cooker. Every interaction is scrutinized. Every perceived slight carries consequences. And when violence erupts, it does so with overwhelming force. The homicide of Michael R. Shalon was not an anomaly. It was a predictable outcome of placing deeply violent offenders with entrenched gang identities into prolonged confinement. His slaying stands as a reminder that prison is not merely a place of punishment, but an extension of the same criminal world that exists outside its walls. As investigators worked quietly behind the scenes, another cell was sealed, another file opened, and another life was erased. For the CDCR, it was another incident to document. For the inmates involved, it was another step deeper into irreversible consequences. And for the system itself, it was further evidence that the cycle of gang violence does not end. It simply changes location. Michael R. Shalon entered prison convicted of homicide. He left it as a victim of one. His story and the roles played by those suspected of slaying him expose the brutal continuity of violence that defines both the streets and the institutions meant to contain them. In the end, Pelican Bay did not rehabilitate, reconcile, or resolve. It witnessed another homicide, and the silence closed in once again. On November 2nd, 2025, another life was erased inside the reinforced walls of Pelican Bay State Prison, one of California's most notorious maximum security institutions. What began as a routine day behind bars ended as a homicide investigation, adding yet another name to the prison's long and violent history. The victim was 38-year-old Rodrigo Gomez, a man already condemned to spend the rest of his life in prison, whose sentence ended not in a cell, but in blood. At approximately 12:30 p.m., Gomez was inside a housing unit day room, one of the few spaces within the prison where inmates are allowed limited movement and interaction under staff supervision. According to investigators, it was there that Gomez was allegedly assaulted by two fellow inmates, Raul Garcia Jr. and Francisco Ramirez Jr. The attack was sudden and violent, unfolding in a controlled environment that nonetheless proved incapable of stopping what followed. Correctional staff intervened as the assault was underway, moving quickly to regain control of the area. Emergency medical services were immediately summoned, and Gomez was stabilized enough to be transported out of the prison. He was rushed to an outside hospital, but the injuries he sustained were catastrophic. Despite medical efforts, Rodrigo Flores Gomez was pronounced dead. His death was officially classified as a homicide. An improvised weapon was recovered at the scene, a grim reminder of how violence adapts even in the most restrictive environments. In California, prisons, improvised weapons, often referred to as prison-made or manufactured weapons, are a constant threat. Their presence underscores how inmates serving the longest sentences often find ways to arm themselves, knowing that institutional consequences mean little compared to the power and protection violence can provide. Rodrigo Flores Gomez was no stranger to extreme violence. At the time of his death, he was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder. That conviction placed him among the most serious offenders in the state prison system, men who had already crossed legal and moral thresholds that cannot be undone. Life sentences reshape how inmates navigate prison. With release no longer a possibility, survival, reputation, and perceived strength often become the only remaining currency. The two men accused of assaulting Gomez were themselves serving the harshest sentences California law allows. Raul Garcia Jr., 37 years old, was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder. Francisco Ramirez Jr., 42, was serving life without the possibility of parole, also for first-degree murder. Life without parole represents a legal dead end, a sentence that removes any incentive for rehabilitation in the traditional sense and often intensifies prison violence rather than suppressing it. When inmates serving life sentences are housed together, prisons become pressure chambers. Every interaction is governed by hierarchy, alliances, and unresolved conflicts that may predate incarceration by years or even decades. While investigators have not publicly disclosed a motive for the assault, prison homicides of this nature are rarely spontaneous. They are often the result of accumulated tensions, perceived disrespect, or enforcement of informal rules that operate parallel to official prison regulations. Following the attack, Garcia and Ramirez were immediately placed in restricted housing, separating them from the general population while the investigation proceeds. Restricted housing is commonly used in the aftermath of prison homicides to prevent retaliation, preserve evidence, and isolate suspects while facts are gathered. It is a stark, controlled environment designed to halt further violence, but it does not undo what has already occurred. The Pelican Bay Investigative Services Unit launched a formal inquiry into the homicide, working alongside the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office. These investigations are methodical and complex. Surveillance footage must be reviewed frame by frame. Witness statements, if any are given, are carefully evaluated, often against a backdrop of fear and silence. In prison culture, cooperation with authorities can carry deadly consequences, making reliable testimony difficult to obtain. Pelican Bay State Prison has long been associated with extreme sentences and extreme violence. Designed to house California's most dangerous offenders, it operates under constant tension. Even with heavy surveillance, controlled movement, and layered security, the institution remains vulnerable to sudden eruptions of brutality, particularly in communal spaces like dayrooms, where inmates briefly come into contact under supervision. The homicide of Rodrigo Flores Gomez reflects a broader reality of life sentence incarceration. When all individuals involved are already condemned to die in prison, the deterrent effect of punishment diminishes. Administrative discipline, loss of privileges, or additional time become meaningless. In that environment, violence becomes a tool used to assert dominance, settle scores, or enforce unwritten codes that govern inmate life. For correctional staff, the incident marked another critical failure point, a moment where control was challenged and a life was lost despite intervention. For investigators, it became another case file, another reconstruction of violence inside walls designed to prevent it. And for the families connected to all three men involved, it represented an irreversible finality. Gomez's death did not occur in isolation. It joined a pattern of lethal incidents at Pelican Bay that continue to raise questions about the management of inmates serving life and life without parole sentences. These cases reveal a paradox at the heart of maximum security incarceration. The very inmates deemed too dangerous for society are often placed together, creating environments where violence feeds on itself. As the investigation continues, Garcia and Ramirez remain confined, their futures now potentially shaped by additional criminal charges layered onto sentences already measured in lifetimes. Whether prosecutors pursue new homicide charges will depend on evidence gathered in the coming months, evidence collected in a world where silence is enforced and truth is often buried beneath fear. Rodrigo Gomez entered prison convicted of first-degree murder. He died inside it, the victim of another act of lethal violence. His homicide stands as a stark illustration of how life sentences do not end violence. They concentrate it. Behind the concrete walls of Pelican Bay, the cycle continued once more. Assault, intervention, death, investigation, and silence. On November 2nd, 2025, another inmate did not make it back to his cell, another homicide was logged, and another reminder was delivered. Inside California's most secure prisons, death does not respect sentences, supervision, or steel doors. It arrives suddenly, and it leaves nothing behind but unanswered questions and a body count that continues to rise. In the late 1990s, Pelican Bay State Prison was no longer just a maximum security facility on California's remote northern coast. It had become the epicenter of a violent experiment spiraling out of control. Behind the sealed steel doors of its security housing unit, a white supremacist prison gang tightened its grip, unleashing what prosecutors would later describe as a full-scale reign of terror. At the center of that storm was the Aryan Brotherhood, a gang whose influence inside Pelican Bay transformed isolation cells into execution chambers and cellmates into instruments of homicide. Between roughly 1996 and 1998, a disturbing pattern emerged within the SHU. Inmates were not being slaughtered in chaotic riots or open-yard assaults. Instead, they were being methodically slayed in silence. Victims were found strangled inside their own cells, often by the very men they were locked in with, cellmates who were fellow Aryan Brotherhood members or trusted associates. These were not spontaneous acts of rage. They were targeted homicides, carried out with chilling restraint, exploiting the prison's own security design. The security housing unit was intended to isolate the most dangerous inmates, locking them down for 22 to 23 hours a day, limiting movement and eliminating opportunities for coordinated violence. Instead, it became the perfect environment for internal enforcement killings. With only 2 men per cell and minimal direct supervision, the Aryan Brotherhood turned confinement into a weapon. Orders were issued, loyalty was tested. And when an inmate was marked, death came quietly, hands tightening around a throat until breathing stopped. One of the earliest confirmed incidents occurred on February 2nd, 1996. Arthur Ruffo, an Aryan Brotherhood member himself, was found strangled inside his cell. His killer was not a rival gang member, but his own cellmate, an Aryan Brotherhood associate. The message was unmistakable. Membership did not guarantee safety. Obedience did. The homicide sent shockwaves through the SHU, reinforcing the gang's authority and demonstrating that no one was beyond reach. The violence did not stop there. On July 25th, 1997, Aaron Marsh, another Aryan Brotherhood member, was also found strangled in his cell. Once again, the suspect was an associate from within the same ideological circle. These were not random victims. They were targeted removals, part of an internal purge that relied on silence, fear, and absolute control. Through 1997 and into 1998, similar strangulation homicides continued, each reinforcing the gang's dominance and exposing the prison's inability to intervene. What made these slayings particularly alarming was their consistency. No weapons were required, no alarms were triggered. The human body itself became the tool of homicide. Inmates were killed where they slept, where they were supposed to be safest, under a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of violence. Each death followed the same grim formula: isolation, opportunity, and a cellmate willing or ordered to carry out the act. Prosecutors would later acknowledge what correctional officials struggled to contain at the time. A Del Norte County Deputy District Attorney publicly blasted prison administrators, stating they were unable to stop the Aryan Brotherhood's reign of terror. The comment was more than criticism. It was an indictment of a system that had ceded control inside its most secure unit. Despite intelligence reports, lockdowns, and administrative segregation, the gang continued to orchestrate homicides from within locked cells. The Aryan Brotherhood's power during this period was rooted in absolute discipline. Associates were expected to follow orders without hesitation. Refusal meant becoming the next target. Compliance meant survival. The cell strangulations were not only acts of violence, but acts of governance, enforcing rules that existed outside official prison policy. In the SHU, the gang's authority rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, that of the state. Pelican Bay's late 1990s homicide surge forced a reckoning within California's prison system. The very structure meant to isolate violence had been exploited to enable it. Guards could not see inside cells continuously. Cameras could not capture every moment. And once a strangulation began, it was often over before intervention was possible. The design that emphasized control over contact became the gang's greatest asset. By the end of the decade, the legacy of those years was clear. The SHU had become synonymous, not just with isolation, but with silent death. The Aryan Brotherhood's campaign of internal slaughter left multiple bodies behind and exposed a fatal flaw in prison security philosophy.